Hi, Marla.
Hello, Mirabelle. What a joy to see you.
You as well. And I'm really excited that we're having this conversation and recording it because we have a lot of conversations.
Yes.
And there's, and just before we recorded this, we were sort of just catching up and talking about how, the value of having diversity in points of view and in experience and embodiment in all rooms. Whether it's having an economist be in a space that people are talking about healing or vision work, or having someone that's understanding the biology and the energetics of how trauma shapes the economic impact of it, both the measurable and the ones that just can't be measured but can be felt really strongly. Um, and so, to anyone that's listening, we're just having a conversation and hoping um, that you receive something from this that shifts your perspective, such that you approach whatever the mundane is in terms of what we're doing in life, in our work, and in our day-to-day relationships with a lens that is curious and fresh and open-hearted and yet accounts for the mind and the data. Does that sound
For
resonant,
sure, for
Marla?
sure. And you know what? Why this is so pertinent and relevant is because we are all human beings and all economic decisions on this planet are made by human beings, whether you are a government minister, whether you are in a personal household setting and you make decisions for your household, and also as an individual and in your community. So obviously, whatever affects us as humans, like everything you just outlined, in that essence, will affect whatever economic decisions we make, and will therefore affect the rest of us in terms of the outcomes of those economic decisions. And so, yes, I'm here for it.
Amazing. And do you just want to, because not everyone might be familiar with your background or what you, and I'm sure there are people that are outside the Caribbean that will be listening as well. So if you can just give some context into your journey, like what curiosity brought you to economics, um and particularly, secondarily then into the understanding that or exploring that in the Caribbean.
Yeah, so I'm from Trinidad and Tobago, which is a twin island state in the Caribbean, which is we're at the bottom of the chain of Caribbean islands, right? So we're the last, almost touching Venezuela. I think we're six, is it miles or kilometers? I forget which unit from Venezuela. So very close to the mainland of South America. Um, and I have lived and worked in the Caribbean most of my life, but I lived in Barbados for a few years. So not just Trinidad and Tobago. And my love and passion for economics started when I was in high school in A levels. I don't know that they still call it that, but
They do.
opening an economics textbook and just falling in love. And that was my first and still my biggest love apart from my family, you know. Um, and so spent many years in academia studying, doing bachelor's, master's, another master's, which was supposed to finish in a PhD, and I stopped before I got there. And then now I'm doing another PhD. And so I spent a lot of time learning about this, but also working in the field of economics, in banking, as economist for a few banks in the region. And then as of 2017, really starting my own consulting business. So almost 10 years of doing that. And doing advisory work for many private sector entities, sitting on boards of directors in the Caribbean, that in pan-Caribbean organizations, and advising governments as well. So that's me in a nutshell. Um, and more and more, especially in the last 10 years, especially, coming out of global financial crisis, coming out of COVID, and actually, the global financial crisis prompted me and inspired me in doing my MPhil uh, thesis to look at behavioral economics because
Mm.
recognizing that our behavior is what, when I say our humans, our behavior and our decision making is the thing that really drives eventually the economic outcomes that we all participate in. And so did my thesis on behavioral economics back in, 2000 and I would say 2010 or so. And then most recently, looking at and thinking more seriously about the whole concept of gross national happiness. And when people hear that, they get like, they roll their eyes and they're like, oh my God, happiness is so subjective. How could you even? But no, maybe gross national happiness could use with some rebranding because I feel like it immediately tells people this is something that's sort of airy-fairy, it's subjective, it's not ever something that we can really implement, and that's actually quite wrong. I mean, gross
Mm.
national happiness, which of course was something that was conceptualized and implemented in Bhutan, and it was conceptualized by their fourth king in the 1970s. So it's been around for a long time.
Wow.
Yes, actually, G&H was part of what helped to shape the Sustainable Development Goals.
Huh.
Recognizing that GDP cannot be the thing that we aim for, GDP growth, that is, or expansion of
Mhm.
G of how we measure the economy, recognizing by the United Nations that we have to look at things like all the Sustainable Development Goals, things like eliminating poverty and eliminating starvation and hunger and financial inclusion and all of the elements that go into the SDGs. So this gross national happiness for me is now the next chapter in this long journey that I've been
Mm.
on.
Amazing. What I find amazing, and I actually just want to share that Marla just got back from Bhutan, and that's how we sparked this conversation. We'd been talking before she went to Bhutan, and I had a friend that, had been in Bhutan, that was ex-Harvard, that, was part of this whole exploration. And so I was, aware of it. And even though my background is in, vision work and healing and clarity, really,
Yeah.
I also was a little skeptical about I'll be honest, because I'm also quite left brain. I was a bit like, yeah, is this like some kind of like a tourist trap,
It's not,
So,
no.
yeah, and at the same time, I was intrigued because I knew just from my experience of studying economics, I always found it very fascinating that um, you know, I remember one of the first things we learned about GDP, and this was, when I was 17, I think, is that it doesn't take into account the unpaid services of mothers and homemakers and, and I didn't know how to sit with that because like, is that a service that you need to put a sum of money on? But then what is the cost if you don't value it? Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly. We don't value
the
it. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And again, there's subjectivity there, which is why they're not putting a cost to it, right? A value to it.
Hmm.
And so this whole idea of happiness and measurability and, you know, and then also making happiness some kind of an ambition, right? So you could have an ambition to make like $1 billion, and that's a benchmark, and you're kind of chasing it.
Hmm.
Um, and then you could then replace that with happiness, and you're still in the chasing. not to say that we don't want it or we're not drawn to financial abundance and an inner sense of abundance that we experience as happiness. But just, so many diverse thoughts around this. And so I was really curious when I'm just going to read what you wrote because I think, you said it perfectly. And so Marla wrote, um, I had been thinking about gross national happiness for half my life. For me, it was a mysterious and enigmatic idea, but universal in relevance and increasingly important all at the same time. So when a friend sent me a link to the first ever gross national happiness program at the Royal Timfu College, I knew this was the universe doing its best work. Ultimately, my 5 immersive weeks in the kingdom of the Thunder Dragon were so much more than learning how to measure what really matters. Because GDP is possibly the worst measure of anything except extraction. It was way more than my imagination could have ever come up with. It was a pilgrimage, it was healing, it was letting go, it was coming home. It was truly life changing.
Yep.
And in that, you spoke to the tangible and the intangible.
Yep.
And in what you wrote, there is no separation and no hierarchy between both. And there's something profoundly truthful about that lack of hierarchy between the money and the economic speaks, and the rest of it is secondary to that. Or that, spirituality or your inner experience of life is most important, and then the rest of it doesn't, money doesn't matter.
Hmm.
There's no hierarchy in what you said. And I love if you can speak um, first about GDP is nothing but a measure of extraction. Like in your
Yes.
boldest, most daring, scathing, direct, honest words.
So, of course, GDP um, is a measure that was constructed by the global north and for their purposes and their agenda, right? So let's first understand where this came from. This did not come from an intention to measure everything, and nor did it come from an intention to measure the things that are um, most, how should I say this? The things that support our well-being the most. It never came from that intention. And so let's recognize that it didn't fail at doing what it was intended to do. So it
Hmm.
measures everything that is formally measurable in an economy. So, like you said, it does not measure the unpaid care work because that has no formalization in terms of transactions with respect to salaries paid and so on. It also does not measure any informal work in the economy. So, for example, those people who are engaging in the informal sector, meaning let's say taxi drivers, let's say hairdressers, let's say housekeepers who are off the books, so to speak, not
Hmm.
within the tax system, not within the social security system. Those people's wages, even though they are earning money, it is not recorded in the formal system, and therefore it does not show up in the GDP statistics. And quite frankly, most of the Caribbean countries, Cayman not so much, but my country, Trinidad and Tobago, and others, we estimate that more than 25% of the economic activity truly taking place in your economy, including those informal things I just talked about, more than 25% of the activity taking place in your economy is not measured and therefore does not show up in the GDP statistics. And so that's the first thing. That's the second thing. Apart from the GDP, it measures what it was set to measure, and it wasn't set to measure everything. The third thing is that Therefore, when you look at what GDP measures, it measures extraction in terms of the productivity of labor. It measures what labor that is on the books is producing. It measures, for example, the extraction of natural resources like oil and gas or forestry or anything related to nature being converted to something that we use. That will likely be measured. Um, and and we have seen it in the literature. You can have a country that is showing quote unquote growth. Guyana, let's take an example, is the fastest growing economy on this planet. And it is growing in terms of GDP. It is growing because it is extracting oil and gas out of the ground and exporting that crude oil. And the government is earning some revenue from that. But the companies that are extracting the oil and gas are earning much, much more than the government. And the average person in Guyana has been receiving some windfalls. Like every year, the government gives this little sort of Christmas bonus to people. So they feel maybe better off. But have their education outcomes improved in Guyana? The data doesn't substantiate it yet. Has their health improved? We don't have the data on that kind of thing yet. And we don't know whether the people of Guyana, from a well-being standpoint, are yet benefiting from what's happening from what the GDP is measuring. And I suspect it will take a while for those things to be measured and for the data to come to us. For example, the poverty rate declining. We just don't know yet. They haven't measured it yet. So my point to you is that you can have a country that's the fastest growing economy from a GDP standpoint, yet we are unaware um, if people are really being made better off by GDP, or what if they're being made worse off? And actually, there is an argument that says because the price of everything has been going up, including property, there is a good chance that there are some people who might be even worse off because they are now struggling with the cost of living, particularly people who are pensioners, for example, and on a fixed income,
Mm.
or people who rely on remittances from abroad, which is a big segment of the population, and they are used to getting, let's say, $200 US a week, and they can live comfortably on that. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe that's not as comfortable now. So GDP is not good at measuring the things that really matter from a human well-being standpoint. And that's sort of the crux of the matter when you look at why then should we be considering other measures. So, for example, the UN came up with the Human Development Index, which looks at measuring things around education outcomes and specific health outcomes like infant mortality and longevity and so on. But they still put the GDP per capita in the Human Development Index, which I don't know why, but they did. The UN also recently commissioned a group of experts. One of them is a Jamaican economist called Dr. Damian King, for them to come up with an alternative to GDP. And instead of them to my disappointment, and instead of them coming up with this one measure that says, this is your number, it's 12, and the goal should be 15. What they came up with is a dashboard of the many
Mm.
things that we should be measuring. Now, we already have this dashboard for the Sustainable Development Goals. Each country is supposed to be monitoring their sustainable development goals in a dashboard type format. So they came up with something that resembles that instead of like a number that you can say, okay, my GDP growth is 2%
Mm.
and my well-being growth or my well-being index value is 12 out of 15.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
need to
yeah,
have a measure that sort of
yeah,
tells
like
you
apples for apples.
yes,
Yeah.
and a measure that tells you where we are relative to other countries, and a
Hmm.
measure that tells you whether we're improving or declining. If you're looking at a whole dashboard, some might be improving, some might be declining, but we need to condense this all into one measure, one index. And that's not hard to do with this dashboard. So I'm
Yeah.
not sure why they didn't do it. And my guess is that they specifically don't want to create the one
Hmm.
measure because it will then, I guess, further weaken the usefulness or appeal. I shouldn't say usefulness, the appeal of a GDP measure and a
Yes.
GDP
Yes.
growth measure.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that there is a lot of benefit in keeping things that can be measurable subjective. And all measures are limited because you set parameters. So all measures of any sort
Yes,
for anything will be a form of limitation because
yes,
you set parameters. And
yes.
yet it's just so much easier to relegate things like, what you're talking about, or happiness, contentment, well-being,
Mm-hmm.
the internal measures of contentment or peace or, whatever, to something that is woo-woo, and subjective.
Yeah.
Because if you actually measured it and compared it apples to apples, it's so stark
Mm-hmm.
that it has the capacity to break through and disrupt this pattern of complacency, that is economically and socially validated. And when I say socially, I mean in a corporate sort of space, validated and um, even celebrated in a way such that, I noticed this pattern, for instance. Obviously the job of a corporation is to make maximum profit, right? Like that's it. What's your bottom line,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
yet, and then that's very numerical and measurable, and
Mm-hmm.
you put targets and you meet your targets, you get your bonuses, and all of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And yet there is then the talk of um how we giving back to society, and
Yeah.
then we'll fund this charity for mental health, or something for well-being, which is, I'm not saying that it's a good or bad thing, but it's so tokenistic in a way, because there isn't this real investment in how can we measure that, and how can we, how are we contributing to those numbers being the way they are.
Yeah. I wish the world was obsessed more with well-being than, compared to our obsession with GDP. Because if we
Mm,
focused on well-being of people and planet, right? Then, and if we used that lens of every decision for every decision we made, then we would be in a much different place, right? We would
yeah,
have
yeah,
emphasis and focus on different things versus just the profit maximization motive that you mentioned.
yeah,
And certainly we are nowhere near that yet. I think we're
yeah,
moving closer with things like, you have triple bottom line, you have ESG, all of these things that have sort of moved through private sector corporate thinking over time that tells you there is a pull in that
yeah,
direction, but we never have really fully operationalized. I mean, I know that there's some regulators that will ask you if you're in a banking sector or in a um, corporate and insurance and so on, what is your ESG policy? And can you share with us what have been your accomplishments and your goals and so on been being met around ESG? But it's not as globally accepted as it should be, in my view.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
yeah.
And what I also see is this, the extraction you're talking about. You
Hmm.
can go on extracting, whether from the earth or from your own energy, because everything's energy, right? And the
Yes.
greatest um, sort of race, I would say, right now is towards both data and energy, and data needs more energy. And, so
Yes.
at the end, it like, as somebody that understands energy and works with that as the primary principle through which everything expresses, I can see that on a global scale, really becoming the center point of, um, what we're sort of moving towards, and where there's either abundance or scarcity.
Yes.
And so when you extract, then there is an amount, whether it's the earth or it's the way corporate sort of working life is set up, or the industry is set up. There is an extent to which then you have, like, you get a greater turn, it's easier to extract. There's so much abundance, then that starts to deplete because you've overmined, or you've,
Yeah.
whatever. And then there is scarcity, and then there's like this rapid depletion, such that, like, if an elevator is going down at a certain rate and then you just cut the cords on it, it's like just accelerated. And I can see that in my work, in people that have been leaders for a long time, or entrepreneurs for a long time, and have gone with this whole obsession and conditioning. Nobody's really aware of it till they sort of become aware of it, with productivity, which is,
Mhm.
can I do more, better, faster? Whether it's the work I'm doing, or it's the amount of money that I'm generating, or how much I'm able to provide my family, which is
Yeah.
also some kind of it's that productivity, more, better, faster, is like a has been this um, sort of slogan of the Industrial Revolution, and trying to keep up with productivity. And the extraction is so much, um, such that the people that were celebrated for that, for how much they could turn around an industry or a company, and, you know, change the bottom line, and, all of that, are now feeling that, um, the sort of wounds of the extraction in their own personal life and health,
Yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
really questioning, is the legacy that I want to leave, um, talking about what difference I can make, or like how much more profit we can make, uh, or is there something else? Because this, I can talk about it, I can go to these conferences, and I can speak these keynotes and crunch these numbers, but inside it doesn't feel right, because I can feel the cost um, of this extraction
Yeah.
in my own life.
Yeah.
And then that kind of lends itself to discussing and sharing what you think about what was your experience of this, gross national happiness, and, personal, and also your observations as an economist.
Yeah, but before I get to my experiences, I just want to add to what you just said because,
Mhm.
we take the extraction from ourselves and from our planet and from our everything to produce. But I want to be clear that the GNH principles and the idea of well-being does not mean that we stop all of that. What it means is
Exactly.
we have to have balance. And you know this better than anybody in my field, right? There has to be balance. And the extraction for the sake of well-being, for example, the people of Guyana have been, in terms of GDP per capita, the lowest in the English-speaking Caribbean for a long time. This country and these people have suffered a lot of socioeconomic hardship, right, for a long time. Then they discover oil, then they can extract this oil. And I, for a moment, would not ever take that away from them. And we've seen the president of Guyana, for example, on BBC Hard Talk, I believe it was, when basically he was accused of, your country is now helping to burn this planet down. And I'm just paraphrasing here, right?
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
had to say, no, hang on, hang on. When the global north burnt the planet down, the fourth industrial revolution, the extraction of oil and gas from the North Sea, from all of these countries in the global north, but also you extract it from the global south that in terms of your colonies that you have possession of, and you were able to develop and you were able to educate your people, you were able to house your people, you were able to build infrastructure, you were able to improve the well-being of your people based on this extraction. Now that the planet is in
Mm.
trouble and we have breached, I think, 6 out of 12 or something like that planetary boundaries, you have breached it in terms of the global north and your extraction, and you have made your people better off. How is it now that me, this poor country from the global south, how is it that you could come and tell me with a straight face and a clear conscience that I should not extract my oil and gas? I think Guyana is well within its right to do that. And the point that I'm making is that we don't just stop doing what we do to create value so that people can lift their standard of living. We don't do that, but we have to balance it. And
Mm.
so now going to the GNH, gross national happiness. So the whole philosophical underpinning of gross national happiness is Buddhism. And before I go into the what that means specifically, I just want to also say that when I spent those 5 weeks in Bhutan and recognized how pervasive the philosophy of Buddhism is in everything that they do in gross national happiness, the way they treat each other, the way that corporations conduct themselves in the private sector, it struck me that our hyper-secularism, in the West
Mm.
really did not serve us well. Because we are secular in the way that we, make laws and conduct business, conduct policy making, but we can be very religious when it comes to fighting wars. We can be very
Mm.
religious
Mm.
when it comes to labeling and judging. Um, and it really did not, that secularism did not give us a value system to hold on to the way that Buddhism gave the people of Bhutan a value system. And what is that fundamental value system? That fundamental value system is about balance. Because Buddha, of course, was born into wealth and was a prince and lived this very princely life, and then decided, I'm going to go on this journey. I'm going to give up, like many monks and nuns and priests do. I'm going to give up this material wealth that I have, and I'm going to live the life of a pauper so that I can be more in touch with my spirituality and learn and expand my spiritual wisdom. And in doing that, and in becoming almost dying, he realized that you can have neither extreme. Neither extreme is going to bring you the fulfillment. Neither extreme of extreme wealth or extreme poverty is going to bring you well-being and fulfillment spiritually or physically. And what we need is the middle path, right?
Mm. Yeah.
And you would know this, Mirabelle, better than me, because this is my very new introduction to Buddhism. But the middle path is what Buddhism, but also gross national happiness, um, encapsulates and advocates for. And so it means that gross national happiness itself looks at four major pillars. One pillar is socioeconomic progress. You can say that GDP is that measure, right?
Mm.
Socioeconomic progress, socioeconomic expansion. The second would be sustainability. So around the planetary boundaries, protecting the planet, but not just the planet in terms of natural resources, also all sentient beings and trees and plants all of life on this planet, from us, protecting it from a sustainability standpoint. Not that we stop all
Yeah,
activity that impacts, because just taking a walk, of course, impacts
yeah,
insects that you're walking on, but
right.
we try to be sustainable. Um, it also looks at good governance. That's a fundamental pillar of gross national happiness. And we know from the literature in economics that the thing that makes or breaks a country, and a whole book was written, Why Nations Fail, that looks at institutional quality. And institutional quality speaks to governance. So things like your institutions, like, for example, your parliament, your judiciary, but even your schools are institutions. Your neighborhood watch is an institution. Institutions are people gathered around a particular idea, with certain rules about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and we have a particular goal in mind. And institutional quality makes the difference whether you will progress or not, or you will end up being a failed state. And so that fourth pillar, in fact, looks at governance. Um,
I lost you
so
for a moment, Marla.
when you think about gross national happiness, people like to check. Oh dear, am I back on? I see that you're
Yes,
frozen.
now
I'm
you are.
frozen. Yeah, so I'm back.
You're back. Yes.
Okay. Um, yes, and so, whilst we think that gross national happiness and happiness on the whole is so subjective and we can dismiss it as, oh, you could never really measure that, it actually is quite measurable based on their definition. And I just want to emphasize that gross national happiness by no means that you focus only on, well, if I never have to work again, I'll be happy. And if somebody, it's not that. It's about balance. It's about balancing that we have responsibilities to people, planet, and each other, but we have to balance the growth that we're trying to achieve economically with the well-being of people and planet. Because if we only focus on the GDP, we end up jeopardizing our well-being. And what's the point of having high GDP and everybody on the planet is dead, basically,
Yeah, yeah,
in an
yeah.
extreme case.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And there's such a high level of illness and sickness, both mental, physical, and it's all part of even in economically, the countries that have historically been involved in extraction and colonization and, all of that, which is enough data to show us that that is very limited and flawed and, skewed towards one very binary idea of what progress is and what the goal of human life is.
Yep.
And it's interesting when I was hearing you talk now, there's a thing that I have clients do which is called an internal energy audit, and
Oh.
we look at the places in which energy is leaking, and that could
Mm.
be you're hesitant to say something because you're scared about how it will be perceived,
Yeah.
or doesn't fit into, the corporate space, or,
Yeah.
there are various different measures to literally come up with this balance sheet of what is the, like, if you do cost benefit analysis of
Right.
leaking your energy and not being true to yourself, because there's a repercussion that deviation from the truth that you know to be true for yourself, and what you're here, what your gift is, and what you're here to share in the world, a deviation from that, just a little bit, and then the next fractal is even further, and then suddenly you've reached a state of dis-ease,
Mm-hmm.
but it's been those fractional, like, minute little degrees of deviation from integrity with yourself that have
Mm-hmm.
led then to this burnout, which is, why is there the burnout? Because there's such a lack of congruity or congruence and coherence in the way that we are designed to live and in the way that we choose to live to perform to the standards of the conditioning that we have been taught are valuable.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really don't see it as separate, like you said, it's measurable because we do this in my work, so I know it's measurable and and yes, there is an amount of subjectivity, but that's true with even economic data. There's things you don't capture, and there's things that
Yes.
are captured only through a certain lens. So I think that's universal. And being able to hold the opposites is so important because when you're talking about balance, uh, again, we're getting away from this idea of duality that this is right and that is wrong because you're taking the context away uh, of a certain philosophy. So, for
Yeah.
example, if we look at economics as a philosophy, because everything is based on some philosophy, and of course there are different, but it's like your value is
Yes.
based on how much you produce, right? That's the philosophy of economics. And correct me if I'm misunderstanding, because I'm not
No,
an
you're
expert in
fundamentally
economics.
correct. Yes. Hmm.
And so then the philosophy of spirituality, well-being, all of that has a as a philosophy where we take into account that you are more than the sum total of your productivity. And how do we account for wholeness without um without limiting it. So there are the things we can measure, like we can measure how well you sleep by some biometric data, but we can also measure it by honestly how good do you feel when you wake up,
Yeah.
because it's no point if you have all the data and then you're still waking up feeling
Miserable.
crappy, even though you're saying miserable, right? And so there's a place um, for holding the highest standard, which is that our propensity is towards being ourselves, and that is wholeness. And how can we honor that, even in the limited capacity that we can at this time, without making the numbers a reflection of our worth? Because the way I
Yeah.
see it also, the way that we have, um, like economics is like sort of like the North Star of the way the world functions, right? It's that gold standard. And then it has a, um, a sort of an effect on everything, because then you
Yeah.
measure your worth based on your net worth. Or if you look at a limited idea of self-help, spirituality, personal development, you measure your self-worth. So
Yeah.
we're constantly measuring worth, and not that I'm saying that that's wrong. It's not wrong. It's just recognizing the limitation of it and being like, yes, this is a measure and I am whole no matter what this is. And I can obviously keep looking at ways to, and we can say it in terms of improve, or looking at ways to um to honor my wholeness and the wholeness of the planet. And that means holding different points of view even if I don't agree with them. And there's a lot of peace in that, and there's so much lack of wellness when there's self-righteousness
Oh, I like that.
you know
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, and I mean, on the whole point of measuring, I mean, having spent, half my life basically devouring statistics, we know that from the time you start to measure something, even if you're going to measure the distance between here and here, from the time you start to measure something, you start to make mistakes. Because even if you're measuring the distance between here and here, if the ruler you're using is not calibrated correctly, you're going to make a mistake on exactly where, how long this distance is. And also, are you measuring it from this side or from this side? There's all kinds of interpretation on what you're actually measuring. So from the time we start to measure anything, we start to make mistakes. Nothing that is ever measured is 100% accurate. And also, there are some things that can't and probably should never be measured, right? And
Yes.
so I feel like when you think about balance and you think about well-being, and of course, there's a lot of subjectivity in there, we know, you know, that sometimes the things that influence how we feel are things like the moon, things like hormonal fluctuations, things like humidity, altitude. Being
Mm,
in Bhutan at 3,000 meters high, you don't feel the same as when you're in Cayman at sea level. Things, the way the body works changes,
totally. Yeah.
right? And so this thing about how do I feel and my well-being on any given day is not something we should even try, I think, to measure
Mm,
completely, and I don't think we can. And these are it's subjective variables that we cannot manipulate. We can't.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel like that's also something that's important to recognize when you think about balancing economic goals with well-being. We know that there is
Mm,
subjectivity, a ton of subjectivity in here, but there's also a ton of weakness on this side, on the GDP side,
yeah.
right? And so
Yeah.
let's recognize that there is so much weakness in statistics in the first place. That, however, does not mean that it is
That we
not
don't do it. Yeah.
exactly, that it's not a reasonable goal to try to improve um, material well-being, let's call it that, because that's essentially what GDP is supposed to be trying to measure, material well-being in GDP per capita, particularly. Trying to measure and balance material well-being and spiritual, physical, emotional, mental, psychological well-being, and also well-being of the planet. Because again, if we don't do that, then it negates the other two, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
And I feel like that's what the GNH comes closest to doing, in my view.
Mm, excellent. As you were talking, there was, and the subjectivity of measuring, like you said, for example, if you're using, I remember with weather, they used to use a piece of hair to measure something. I don't remember, it was in school, and then the humidity affects the length of the hair or, whatever it is. But
Yeah.
then you come up with a standard number. And so in that context, and, we've had some of these conversations before. I'm curious if you would share around, you know, history, not in terms of the data or the numbers or the facts, what happened in a historical geographical location, but because those facts also come from the point of view of whoever's telling the story,
Yes.
um, right? And therefore,
History,
there's his
HISTOR, his
exactly.
story. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
And but there is an impact and we've spoken about it specifically in the Caribbean because you work with governments, I work with governments, and um the way that we're trying to do something that is based on the standard of the colonizers in a culture where we have essentially been colonized. And it's not about the colonization, but it's about the impact that has had on things like I remember when I was researching specifically in the Caribbean, the higher propensity towards diabetes, for example,
Yes.
because of the lack of nutritive food that was given to people as
Yes.
indentured laborers or slaves, which then
Yes.
changed their genetics, which makes them more predisposed to certain diseases. And then obviously the incidence of diabetes affects whether people have access to healthcare, it affects insurance premiums, it affects your economics. But we're not talking about that cumulative impact, and not just the impact, but what can we do to shift that? Because it affects perception, affects your ability. Another thing that I looked at, not just in the Caribbean, but particularly in the Caribbean because of the work I was doing, is the impact of the fear of, you were like our ancestors, some of them were slaves or indentured laborers, and so there was a lot of force there, and there was a lot of need to conform. And if you spoke up, you would die. And then that affects the ability today of people to speak up, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or for example, you notice if a person is being too direct in our Caribbean culture, people say you need to have respect. Like, where's your
Yeah.
respect?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying be disrespectful, but there is, which the newer generations kind of breaking out of in some ways, um, this conditioning that if you speak your truth, you're gonna die. And it's
Yeah.
held in our biology because there's epigenetics, which is the way that genes express based on, your conditioning and your environment. And we don't talk about that. We don't talk about how that's affecting us in the Caribbean at an economic level, making decisions,
Yeah.
standing up for, what's important, like the Prime Minister or President of Guyana did, right? Like, he spoke up and he
Yeah.
said, "Who are you to point a finger at me?" And I'm curious what you see, having looked at in some ways. I know we've talked about this, how trauma shapes economics and the cost of not addressing that at a very deep level.
Yeah, I think this is more in the realm of your work, Mirabelle, than mine because it, I don't know that my field can really truly capture what these effects have been and continue to display, and how do we correct for that. Of course, there's a massive reparation movement. It is one of the key sort of agendas of CARICOM around slavery reparations. And I know that the reparation movement globally has taken some cognizance of the epigenetics and of the effects, the way that trauma can be passed down in your genetics to your future generations who have no idea about this trauma. And
Exactly. Yeah.
you and I have discussed this book, Healing from Our History, that just opened my eyes about the fact that 200 years of famine in India means that people like myself and my family, we are more, and you too, and your family, we are more predisposed to diabetes than any other ethnicity on this planet. And we get heart disease younger than any other ethnicity on this planet. And the data is there to show that. And the data shows it. And so it makes you wonder what's wrong with us. We eaten too
Mm.
much barfi, right? Clearly. But no, that's not the problem. We eaten
Yeah.
barfi, but that's not what's really causing, you
Yeah.
know, the diabetes. It's because our bodies have been adapted to famine. And we live in an age of abundance. We do not live in an age of famine. And so, therefore, we don't need to eat the barfi to get the diabetes. We just need to eat rice. And we need to eat the things and the quantities that our grandparents and forefathers didn't have. And we eat it in quantities reasonable for us now, and it's killing us. And
Yeah. Yeah.
who's going to ever help us deal with that? Who's ever going to, implement the healthcare systems and early interventions that we actually need to address this? Certainly, the governments in the Caribbean don't have the resources to do that and to start
Mm.
screening people from their teenage years, versus screening in your 50s, which is what most people, I guess, who have access to private insurance are screening from 40s and 50s. So I feel like from an economic standpoint, I do not have any faith in us correcting this and addressing it and making it right. I actually do not think that there is enough momentum in the reparations movement, enough comprehensiveness in the reparations movement to
Mm.
address this. The
Mm. Mm.
reparations movement is looking at, you need to give us some money. And to be honest with you, sometimes I wonder if this is not just about the money. And to me, and I've written about this, I wrote a paper where I valued what France owes to Haiti.
Mm.
And to me, in the first place, how do you put a value on a human life? How do you put a value, a monetary value on human suffering? You cannot. You cannot. You can't even quantify this amount of suffering, much less put a dollar value in it. So for all of those reasons, I don't think that my field, economics, um, policy making, measuring statistics, I don't think we can ever really truly capture what the history that our forefathers in the Caribbean have endured, and therefore the effects on us today. But I do feel that the space you're in and the space around, um, you know, we've become less and less averse to getting psychological therapy and our mental health awareness has improved dramatically in one generation. And I do feel like the healthcare and the health sector will and has already and will continue um, to be aware of this and to deal with it on a proactive basis for those who can afford access and for those governments who um, acknowledge it and provide it for their people. But the GDP is never going to take this into account. Never.
Yeah. So I'm just curious. I mean, I get what you say about the reparation movement, and I see it the same because, um, it's kind of um retrospective or retroactive in that
Yeah.
way. And it has a
Yeah.
place, but at the same time, sometimes there's a lack of taking personal responsibility for the present. And sort of waiting on accountability and having some kind of it's not conscious, but it's a subversive kind of entitlement, you know.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
but what I'm curious about is really how would you see if leaders were more aware of how their history has shaped their epigenetics, which includes the way that you think and the way that your brain functions.
Yes.
Um, if leaders were more aware of that personally and collectively, and it doesn't take that much, you don't need that much to become aware of it.
No,
How
you
would
could
that
read a book or two.
change?
Yeah.
Yeah, how would that change the way that they approach governance?
Yeah.
And,
That's an important point.
because I think because like what works for America cannot work for the Caribbean. And I think
No.
I've seen you write about it, right?
Yes.
But we're still, because of the, various things, there's the big brother bullying and, all of that as well. But there's also, um, we don't have another frame of reference,
You're
or
right.
we are too afraid, and it's not something we're vocal about, but it's very sort of subconscious, of creating another standard
Yes.
that that is not in attack of the existing standard, but it just takes a lot of uh, I would say self-trust and courage to be able to create a different um,
Yes.
way of approaching. And it's like we're trying to fix, 11 years of living in the Caribbean, and I love it. I love Cayman. It's like we're trying to fix something that, um, it's like taking the wrong cookie cutter and trying to cut a shape that it's not going to work. Like
Yeah.
it will work, but only partially. And so I'm not even talking about actively necessarily doing something, but even if, awareness is the greatest tool we have
Awareness.
because it
Yes.
allows us to
I
look at our
agree with you.
patterns.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's neutral. It's neutral because you're in this sort of fly on the wall looking at yourself and looking at the way that the patterns that show up in how you speak or the way you interact with people or the policies you make, and not making it right or wrong, but just having awareness. And that awareness alone is the light that shifts to more clarity as opposed to judgment, which
100%.
gets into I'm doing it better than you should do it like me, whatever,
Yes.
right? It's just like a huge, massive energy leak. Um, And so then it saves energy from going into the I'm like this, my country or my region is like this because this happened, or because we're, retaliating or reacting to what you said or did or will do and blacklist us if, and I'm not saying that that does need to be taken into consideration, but just having, yes, that's the practical, and how can I widen the lens to look at what would it be different if I had this understanding of my people and my region,
Yeah.
such that we're no longer loyal to that conditioning that runs the way that we.
I 100% um agree with you that this awareness is very much needed on a personal level in the Caribbean, but also on the level of decision makers in the private sector and the public sector. I feel like there is not enough of that awareness, and there's not enough of that understanding of why we are the way we are. So the fact that, for example, we have institutions that were built and designed for extraction by our colonizers. And those extractive institutions that persist today are not designed to promote our progress. They're not designed for that. Designed for extraction to take somewhere else. And therefore, the policymakers, if they had this understanding, they would understand why we need institutional reform, why we need to deliberately remove the extractiveness, the extractive propensity, if you will, of our
Mm,
institutions,
mm,
meaning our judiciary, the way our tax institutions work, the way our governments make laws, the way our laws are implemented and enforced. All of these things have their roots in extraction, and we need to be aware, first of all, like, to your point, but we need to also take a very critical approach to reform. And how do we reform to remove extractiveness? To me, that would be a huge game changer for the region, to your point. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, yes.
Can you give me an example quickly, Marla? I know we're running out of time, but if you can just give me an
Yes,
example of, like, when you said these, in judiciary or in, can you give me an example of how you might see that shift, just so that we, ground it in something that people can tangibly think about?
for sure. Look at our education system. We have an education system that wants kids to start school at the age of 3, where you have countries, Scandinavian countries, that don't send their children to formal education until they're 7 or 8 years old. But because we needed people to be out working in the fields, we have an education system that wants you to send your child to school from 3 years old. And if you wait until they're 7 or 8, they won't get into the primary school, and they will miss that escalator, that ladder. And then the way that we're educating children, still blackboard and chalk in most schools, even universities in the Caribbean. Whereas the world is so much bigger now in terms of the ways that children can learn, and certainly the different learning styles, boys and girls. So what we have in the Caribbean is we have women who are more educated than men, and we have been for the past 20 years, but we are still earning significantly less. We're still
Mm,
participating less in the labor force. And all of this is an example of the extractiveness of our education institutions. We're teaching from too early formally. We're teaching in ways that most children are left behind, especially boys. And we're teaching subjects that mean that a lot of people cannot get jobs in the region and cannot get jobs globally, because these are jobs that no longer are growing in demand. And so I just
mm.
wanted to highlight education as in my mind, one of the best examples of how our education system is extractive and is not fit for purpose for our current scenarios and conditions.
Yeah, yeah. Any final thoughts about, this conversation, or something that you feel really called to or passionate about, as an economist, as a woman, as someone who's, equally interested in her own inner journey and, this balance.
I would say don't dismiss the idea of gross national happiness. Just Google it, have a look at it. Those four pillars of sustainable socioeconomic development, um, preservation of the environment, governance, and cultural promotion and cultural preservation. Those four main principles of gross national happiness are universally applicable, and it's what the world needs right now. I encourage you to delve into it. I'm going to write about it soon as I have some time. But I would encourage everybody to have a look at this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Marla. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mirabelle. Thanks for having me. Thanks for always being a friend and for being so supportive and for being part of the growth journey of the Cayman Islands and the Caribbean more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you too.